Hello, welcome if you're just joining us. Um, Welcome to this webinar. I'll just let people trickle in for just now. My name's Morven and I'm going to be hosting for today. And I'm just going to run us through a bit of housekeeping stuff. But in the meantime, you can use the chat function to just introduce yourself. So you should be able to see a chat function on your screen, and you can say hello in that chat function and say where you're from, what your name is, and if you want, you can tell us what you've had for breakfast. I had quite a boring one actually. I just had cereal and yogurt. So yeah, as I said, my name's Morven. I'm the London Food Poverty Campaign Coordinator at Sustain. I'm going to be hosting and also will be speaking a bit about on the webinar itself as well. Just to let you know, this is a webinar, not a Zoom call, so it means you can use the chat function, but you can also use the Q&A function, but the only people who will be seen will be us, who are the speakers and the panelists. We are recording, but it's only us that are going to be seen anyway. So you should be able to see a Q&A function on your screen. And for that, if you have any questions for the speakers, please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat. Use the chat to just introduce yourselves, share information, share links, a bit more of a social space. But if you ask a question in the chat, we probably won't get to it just because we won't be able to get to it for kind of technical reasons. But I think that's most of the housekeeping things. So I think I will kick us off. Brilliant. So at this webinar, you're going to hear from a few speakers. The webinar itself is about assessing local action on food. So we'll kind of do a bit of a deep dive into a few different ways that this might be done. You're first going to hear a bit more from me, and then also from Amy. So I'm the London Food Poverty Campaign Coordinator at Sustain, and Amy works across our London Food Link project. You're then going to hear from Hannah Fenton, who works on the Buckinghamshire Food Partnership and some of the assessment work that she's done there. And then we'll have two speakers from Food Power, which is a network of food poverty alliances across the UK. We'll hear from Simon, who coordinates that network, and then Andrea, who coordinates one of the food poverty alliances in Middlesbrough. So I'll dive straight in. I'll be starting us off just with an introduction to a piece of work that myself and Amy have done for Sustain, which is a London-focused piece of work. So this is the Response, Resilience and Recovery Report, which replaces and combines Sustain's two established reports which assess local action on food. These are the Beyond the Food Bank reports and the Good Food for London reports. This new report that was published in 2020 brings together questions and themes from those two reports. So we weren't starting from scratch. And it aims to be a benchmarking tool that assesses how all 33 London Borough Councils are doing to encourage and promote a sustainable and healthy food environment in their borough and to address food poverty in their borough. So particularly pertinent this year with COVID-19. I'm gonna get into some detailed content about the report shortly, but first I want to talk about the content of the report, context of the report that it's situated within, and the reasons for doing this type of monitoring report, because that's the main focus of this webinar in particular. So why would we want to do this kind of monitoring report at all? Work on food in different areas varies widely, and that's one of the main reasons that we do these reports. Some areas have robust and well-executed food poverty action plans. They've got designated teams working on a range of issues from free school meals to food markets. They put time, energy and resource into collaborative coordination of food partnerships and alliances. But in some areas, none of this work is present, or it's only present a little bit. So there's a real discrepancy in terms of how much work is put into food. Despite these discrepancies, there's no national monitoring of local authority action on food. So in London, Sustain has been benchmarking council action on food poverty and food since 2011. So through the two reports that this response, resilience and recovery reports combines. We think that this greater transparency helps local people, community groups and campaigners to hold their council to account. In other areas across the UK, local authorities could be held to account through similar monitoring, and we think that some of the learnings from this report could be applied. Some of the methodology and questions could be used in other areas. So we're keen to hear if people are interested in doing this type of work after they've heard a little bit more about it today. So I'm now going to go into a little bit of what is in the report itself before talking about its efficacy as a campaigning tool. So what was in the report? The new report looked at how well London Borough Councils were responding to the COVID-19 crisis. We realised that this was kind of overturning a lot of work on food, so we really needed to think about their work on food in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And we were seeking answers to questions like what foundational work brought about a better response to the COVID-19 crisis in some areas, what were councils already doing that quietly facilitated greater individual and community resilience in the face of the crisis. So it's really about the kind of work that was there beforehand that then enabled a better response to the crisis itself. And the report, we're going to hear a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of how we actually did the survey and our methodology from Amy in a bit, but in terms of the broad findings of the report, we found that many factors were exactly the policies and practices that we had been advocating in the past beyond the Food Bank and Good Food for London reports. So especially the partnership model and also systemic poverty reduction strategies like having a London living wage or council tax reduction. So really key here was having this joined up approach where councils work collaboratively with the local voluntary and community sector through partnerships or alliances. And the key thing here was having resource that was put into those. So having staff time on it, as well as having buy-in from multiple different actors in the local area. Similarly, having cash first programs such as local welfare assistance schemes, and as I mentioned, things like council tax reduction was really, really important for that resilience in the face of the crisis. Now, as I said previously, the report is first and foremost a campaigning tool. We're aiming to benchmark and reveal what's going on. It's not so much an academic report as it is a campaigning tool that aims to influence policy and practice. We want to have a genuine and very fact-based knowledge of what's going on. So in that case, in that instance, it's a little bit academic, but primarily it's about influencing. And this influencing and impact comes in two forms, quite loosely. I'd see the report as both a hard and a soft campaigning tool, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by those two types of campaigning now. So as a hard campaigning tool, so kind of as a more direct and overt campaigning tool is what I mean by that. It can be used to publicly call for certain boroughs to act in specific ways, so things like e-actions, letters to councillors, letters to council leaders, that sort of thing. And an example of this and also kind of using it as a way to spontaneously react to things as they unfold. So a recent example of this was in Newham, when the council was considering quite drastically scaling back their universal free school meal programme called Eat for Free, that makes all free school meals free for all primary school pupils. And this was quite soon after the report had been released in 2020. And we used the report as a way to then write to the Mayor of Newham. We posted a blog about that, shared this. We encouraged people to sign the petitions that were going around, and this formed part of it wasn't us alone, there was quite a lot of other work going on, but we wrote to the Mayor of Newham. We said that their score in the report would go down, that they were doing really good work, especially on children's access to food, and that their free school meal programme was kind of the gold standard within London. They are one of actually only 4 boroughs that do that. And this, we are pretty certain that that helped to influence the outcome, that this free school meal programme, the changes to it were not carried forward, which is brilliant because we really don't want to see that kind of thing being cut. We're also writing tailored letters to each borough where we think they could improve. And in past years, we've also done things like e-actions, as I've said, targeting certain things. So as a soft campaigning tool, this is actually quite important as well, and where we see a lot of the influence of the report. We know that many council officers pay quite a lot of attention to what is marked within the report, so as in what we ask and then what the questions that would award them points are. And we have unofficial feedback from council officers saying that a lot of the time they'll kind of use this as a way to set out their strategy for work on food. It will highlight to them, it will be a bit of a reflective exercise where they're seeing, oh, I'm doing quite well in this area, but not so well in this other area. And that will influence a lot of practice kind of behind the scenes with council officers as well. Yeah, so that's quite an important way in which it's a soft campaigning tool. Another example of our influence is that the Greater London Authority is currently tendering a programme called the Food Routes Incubator Programme. Some people on this webinar might have heard of that. It's pots of funding available for food partnerships and food poverty alliances in London specifically. And they've said that the findings in the report have been a really important steer in them developing this programme. It's also a curriculum of work where people will learn from one another about what works and what doesn't work. So it's not just pots of money, but it's also kind of a space where people are able to develop their food partnerships and food poverty alliances. And that quite large pot of money that's being dispersed across London, and that peer-to-peer learning from food partnerships was instigated in a large part to do with by this report. So that's a bit of a kind of overview of how and why this type of monitoring can be really beneficial. I think one important thing to say here is that we have been doing this work in partnership with the GLA for several years now, and we've been running the two reports since 2011 and 2015. So it does take time to build up that kind of influence, especially the softer influence, where it's more you have relationships with council officers, and the report is taken quite seriously. It did take us time to build that up, but the kind of harder campaigning tool where you can ask these questions, produce a report, and then do a public facing e-action, that can happen straight away if anyone was wanting to replicate any of that work. So I'm going to hand over now. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but Amy's who co-produced the report with me, is going to add to that with a bit more detail of the nitty-gritty of the report itself and a few other examples from within it. So I will stop sharing my screen, Amy, and I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you, Morven. Can you see that all right? Great. So as Morven mentioned, I'm going to go on to talk more about the methodology behind the survey itself, which led to this response, resilience and recovery report, and how we came up with the questions, the scoring we used to score the survey results, also some pointers on what we found useful to do and not to do, and to give some examples of this in context. So to start with, as Morven said, Sustain has run 2 reports annually for the last 6 years or so to collect useful data on a whole wide range of topics across London Council's work on food. So we had the option this time round in 2020 of repeating the previous surveys, but we started by asking ourselves why we were doing the survey this year and how the information we collected would be used. And it was decided that we wanted to collect new information on how councils had responded to COVID in regards to food, as obviously this had resulted in huge changes to council services. So we decided to ask new questions on their response to COVID, as well as some of the existing questions that we'd asked in the past, so that we had comparable data to previous years and for ongoing years as well. The next question we asked ourselves was, what data are we collecting and what sort of data did we want? So in our case, it was mainly quantifiable data that we thought was necessary and useful. But we also collected some qualitative data to get quotes and narratives from councils so that we had some examples of good practice in local authorities' work on their food response around COVID. So to develop the new questions that we came up with on how councils had reacted to COVID and their work on food, we worked with internal experts or leads on the different areas that we asked questions on in Sustain. So for example, our food growing and our planning leads at Sustain helped us develop questions on the food growing area in the survey. And we also ran some of the questions by external partners as well to get a second opinion. So I'll give some examples of this in practice shortly. But next, just to mention the scoring. So again, we had to decide what was appropriate this year in context of COVID. And in previous years, councils had been given an overall score in these surveys and placed in an overall league table. But this year, because obviously COVID has been incredibly challenging and many organisations have had to respond to large scale food emergencies, we decided it just wasn't appropriate to put councils in a league table as we once had. So instead, we decided to score councils in brackets of no action, some action, good practice and leadership instead. And we scored these within the areas of questions that we asked about in the report rather than giving them an overall score. So for example, a council could have come out with leadership in their food growing response, but just some action in their response to children's access to good food. So we also, to analyse the results from the survey, we used Excel and we had a pre-agreed scoring document in place before the results came back. So we could decide which activities constituted good practice or constituted leaderships, and councils couldn't be leaders unless they ticked a certain set of boxes under each area for this. And again, we worked with the leads at Sustain that I mentioned before to allocate what was leadership and what was good practice. And we found that having this document in place beforehand and using Excel was incredibly helpful with the huge amount of data that came back so that we could score fairly and consistently. So to put this in context, Sustain has been developing its work on the area of good food economy, and this was a new area in the report in 2020. So we previously didn't have questions on this area. So to come up with the questions on this, we started by looking at internal Sustain publications that had recommendations for councils on the area of a good food economy, which, just to define actually, is how councils work with good food retailers, with food enterprises and with food markets. So we looked at existing Sustain documents and reports that had recommendations. We also worked with those in Sustain who worked on this area to ask what they saw as good practice for councils. Also worked and looked at partner organisations' websites and documents. So in this example, in this case with the Good Food Economy, it was the Sustainable Food Places website. And then beyond this, we also did a bit of sort of mini market research. So I called up a group of London farmers markets and also several retailers who had worked with councils during COVID and relied on council supports, and asked them what they saw as good practice and how councils could have better supported them or were supporting them. So this helped to come up with questions on this section. And another example on how we came up with the questions in the way that I described before. So the food growing section of this survey we had asked beforehand, but obviously we were updating these questions given the impact of COVID. So I worked alongside the food growing lead at Sustain to come up with questions here to decide what was relevant and what she'd be working on moving forward with councils. And she's come back to me since and said that by working through the questions in this way that I described and with her, it's since raised momentum with councils around promoting and supporting food growing initiatives in their areas. And 9 councils have already got back to her and reached out for more support on food growing, having answered the survey. And similarly for the climate section, we hadn't previously had a section on this in the same way before. So again, I worked with the climate change coordinator at Sustain, and we came up with questions and specifically designed them to find out which councils, if any, were taking actions related to food to cut their climate emissions. And we didn't previously have any data at all on this, but now from the survey, we've got clear evidence that London is doing better than the national average here. And we've also got narrative case studies to inspire other councils in London. This has been used as well in a wider toolkit that Sustain's producing about climate change and food across the UK. So that's just an example of how that was used in practice. So to end, I'm just going to give some very practical pointers, some of which may sound very obvious, but Morgan and I reflected after running this survey this year, or last year now. And these were the things we decided were really helpful for us in coming up with the questions and in scoring them as well. So firstly, we suggest limiting the length of open text boxes within a survey because it can be incredibly time consuming. Especially in our case, we made the mistake of not putting a word limit on text boxes, and we had responses from 29 councils across, I think, 8 or 9 areas. So limiting the text boxes can save you some time and make sure you don't miss anything. Also, we suggest making the instructions on the survey itself. We use SurveyMonkey, make the instructions on there very clear and repeat them throughout so that you don't have to go back to people afterwards. And on that note as well, we found it incredibly helpful to have a lead contact at each council. So if anything didn't make sense or there were any problems, we had one person in the council to go back to, which was a lot more quicker and efficient. And as I already mentioned, it was really useful to have a scoring document to keep referring back to when analysing the results, not only to be consistent, but also to make sure we were subjective in our marking of the surveys and analysing the results. And on reflection, we think next year, if we were to do this again, we'd try to get some training, more in-depth training in Excel, because it would have been useful to know how to do the sort of very in-depth formulas that I'm not quite sure how to do to analyse all the data. And finally, which I think this has been reflected in the examples Morven and I have given, collaborating across teams at Sustain and with partner organisations and other organisations made this year's survey collect a lot of rich additional information and has resulted in campaigning tools, as Morven has already said. So yeah, collaboration was incredibly useful for this. So that's me done. I'll just stop sharing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Amy. I think we're now on to Hannah. So over to you, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to chat to you today. Okay, can everyone see me there? That's me at my husband's apple juice stall. So I live in Oxford. I grew up in Buckinghamshire, and I'm working for Sustain, funded by the Rothschild Foundation, to investigate the need for and then start to deliver a food partnership in Buckinghamshire. I'm actually about to go on maternity leave, so I'm handing over to Tejal and Becca to take the Bucks work forward ably. So I've been watching a lot of films and documentaries during lockdown, as many people have. So I've called this the making of time for a Buckinghamshire food partnership. I'm not going to go through the findings as they're available on the website, but we produced this report at the end of September as the culmination of phase 1. And happily, the need was recognised. So now we're delivering phase 2, which is actually setting up the food partnership for Buckinghamshire. So if you want to read the reports, check out the Bucks Food Partnership website, and you can find the summary report and the full report there. So just to give us a little bit of context, this is Buckinghamshire. Both images are thanks to the National Trust. So we have at the top the Chilterns, rolling chalk hills and beech woods, and at the bottom the fertile valley of Aylesbury Vale. So, I mean, you know, why are we bothering to do what is actually quite a lot of work to measure action that's happening in a local area? Well, this sounds like I've got eyes on the prize, and maybe it's true a little bit, but Sustainable Food Places membership is absolutely great. And it's a requirement to join Sustainable Food Places to have a food systems overview. And a food systems overview needs to represent the collective view and the knowledge of the place and the context. And you need to have input from your steering group, from key partners, from stakeholders, and ideally from the public. So it is a requirement in order to get all the benefit from SFP. And the reason I would say that this is required is that it's transformative. If you measure it, you care about it, is something that I always think about. So we had a challenge because we started in January, and obviously in March lockdown started, and I'd never done consultation in a pandemic before. So we took it all online, basically. And there are pros and cons of that, but we did get input from a really good range of actors working towards a cross-sector partnership. So we had our businesses, our charities and community groups, our local authorities, funders, institutions, and so on. We actually deliberately didn't consult the public at this stage, because when we were consulting in about July, the council had put together a consultation with the public on the impact of the pandemic. And so we wanted people to be able to respond to that. There was a question in there on food and food poverty. And our usual methods like street surveys and stalls, putting a pin in a map of what you think's good about food in your local area, what you think could be improved, what's not so good, those kind of things weren't possible. So we really went to representatives of community groups and charity groups as our sort of members of the public, if you like, and then obviously these kind of cross-sector organisations. So what we've got there is we had several food summits where people came together online. We used a Miro board, which is a way of doing sticky notes without being in person with each other. We had a survey. And and then I've presented some of the outputs there. So, Morven and Amy were talking very clearly about how over the years they've built the process and the buy-in and the engagement for this fantastic 3Rs report. The level of detail in that and the response in that is the kind of level that I'd want to see. But we were kind of working at this stage of kind of pre-local authority engagement. Our local authority officers saw the questions from Morven and Amy, which I tried to kind of get going and get answers to in Bucks. They were really interested in it. It's a great set of questions, but they couldn't dedicate the time or get senior buy-in for them to dedicate the time. So really here, the question is how to do this without a high level of local authority engagement that's been built up over a long period of time. What can you do before you have this recognition as a partnership? So what we did was make the most of available data. And what I've put in here is just a little table of all the different sets of data that I kind of sifted through and interrogated to try and get a big picture of what was happening in terms of bucks in food in 2020. So, there's various, it kind of goes in order of what I did. I looked at national stats and local figures. I looked at big picture maps, which you can kind of zoom into a local level. Just Googled and found local reports. There was extrapolation from existing data, which is an interesting one. I'll talk a little bit more about. National campaigning organisations, which tend to highlight things that maybe government data wouldn't. Online searches, social media stories, that enables you to get stories from community groups without necessarily having to ask them a lot of detail and data, which they haven't got the time to put together for you. And you can mop up with your surveying and things like that. FOI requests I found really useful. I made quite good use of those. The important thing about FOI requests is asking what format you want things in. So if you want a spreadsheet, ask for a spreadsheet and specific dates and be as specific as possible. And then when there was a real challenge of a gap, going direct and doing direct surveying and data gathering and direct emails, that's quite time consuming. So I'll talk a bit more about the extrapolation and the direct surveying in a moment. This, I don't want you to read it now, but because we're recording, you can have a look at this afterwards. And I've tried really hard not to use too many acronyms so that if you put this into a search engine, you could actually find all of these things. Some of them are nationally relevant or relevant to your local area. Some of them are only relevant to Bucks, but there might be the equivalent in your local area. And if we go to this level of extrapolation from existing data to fill the gaps, what I actually did is I took some reports that were already existing and sort of said, okay, if they largely hold firm somewhere like Bucks, we could kind of create an equivalent set of measurements from what has been discovered in a different area. So with Food Printing Oxford, it was Oxford, and with City Harvest, it was in London. So Food Printing Oxford was looking at the sort of climate impacts and resources required to feed everyone in Oxford. And I just extrapolated that and said, okay, let's assume that everyone in Buckinghamshire roughly eats what everyone in Oxford does. Therefore, these are the resources that are required. And with the City Harvest allotment yields, it was about allotment yields in London. And I said, okay, if the area of allotments in London is X and the area of allotments in Buckinghamshire is Y, then probably the yields in Buckinghamshire would be equivalent. So, you know, just making a little bit of a guess there, but an informed guess. And then secondly, I said I would talk about direct surveying and data gathering. This was quite interesting. So in some areas where you have a local authority, you can go to your local authority and you can say, please, can you tell me where all the allotments are, how many plots there are, what their area is, how long the waiting lists are, and they can just do that for you. Or there's a confederation of allotments in that area. In Bucks, we couldn't do that. I asked that question of the council and they said, well, that's done at a parish level. So we contacted about 150 parishes to get that data. And I think it is worthwhile, and it's going to help us to make the case for, you know, there being long waiting lists, essentially, thanks to COVID. But it's, if you do that, just be aware that it does take a lot of work. So the idea with this data sheet is that it's something that we can repeat for the future. And it says what the data is, why it matters, where to find it. And what I haven't included, but is really important, is obviously how to manipulate it so you get the equivalent answers next year. So some more tomatoes. This is about stages of engagement. And you can tell that I'm not a statistician, I'm a partnership manager, because one of the things I would say is get it wrong to get engagement. People want to tell you when you've missed something out or your figures don't add up. And I would say it's a balance. You want to build your reputation, not damage it. But, you know, it can be really valuable to put stuff out there and then start to have conversations about the data. And I would say it's led to local authority engagement and action on their own terms. So, for example, with Healthy Start vouchers, they're now promoting them more. They've done quite a lot of work on free school meals recently. And it's led to a groundswell of support to set up the partnership and start delivery. I would say it's cumulative, and you know, the London work has shown that. So the value for the future, I mean, I think it's really important to align with the Sustainable Food Place's 6 key issues, which I put in here. It's also, and that sort of enables you to keep engaging with SFP and start getting the award system and things like that, which is very rewarding for a local area and for your local authority people and everyone really within the partnership. It's a genuine baseline for action planning, of course, and that's both for Sustainable Food Places and food poverty action plans, and you can repeat it in future years to measure progress. But I would take care. Attribution is really difficult. Can we really hope to see progress in some of these big issues? Would holding steady be enough? So just to say, we have a full report which is 50 pages or something, and this is an accessible designed version. Here's some infographics and images from that. And for that, I would say, you know, really try and pick out what's the story, what do people want to know about, and then have the full report with the full info and the detail in the background. So that is pretty much it. We produced this report at the end of September as a culmination of phase 1. Happily, the need was recognised. So now we're delivering phase 2, setting up the partnership. And do check out the Bucks Food Partnership webpage where you can find the summary and the full reports. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Hannah. We're now on to our last section, which is about the Food Power Network. So I'll hand over to Simon first for this.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to be speaking for very long, and then I'll hand over to Andrea to talk about the work in Middlesbrough. So I'll just share my slides. So I coordinate the Food Power Network. So it's a sister network to the Sustainable Food Places Network, supporting food poverty alliances and food partnerships to take action on food poverty, and particularly to longer term responses to food poverty and tackling the root causes with a focus on the local level, so some limitations around that. We've been going for about 3.5 years now as a programme in its own right, and we support food poverty alliances, food partnerships across a whole range of activities to take action, to develop projects, to develop food poverty action plans and other kinds of food strategies to involve people with lived experience. But one key bit of our work has been about supporting some areas to work with us to develop some sort of tool for evaluating the benefits of coming together as an alliance, as a group of people wanting to tackle food poverty in an area. We intuitively think that's a good idea and it should be more efficient, and join the dots and make sure gaps of groups aren't missed by coordinating better in the local area, etc. But we kind of set ourselves a mission to try and evidence that a bit more for ourselves as a programme, but actually really importantly for partnerships themselves, to be able to evidence that to decision makers and funders. Sorry, I'm just trying to move to my next slide. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, strange. There's some sort of animation going on. So we work with 8 food poverty alliances in our Food Power Network over 2 years to support them to develop some and run some local evaluation activities, but also to come together to develop a tool which we ended up calling our impact tracker. And really importantly, I had the logo on the previous slide, we worked with a team at Cardiff University, Sustainable Places Institute, to develop that team. So all credit to Hannah and the team for helping us, Hannah Pitt for helping us to develop that. It was done in the context of food poverty alliances, food partnerships, some having a long history of evaluation of their impact and using a range of surveys to do so. So we always set out to develop a tool that was taking examples from around the country and building that into the tracker tool. And it's really focused on the collective impact of coming together. So it's easier basically, I think, probably to assess the individual impact of an individual project, and we set out to try and help alliances assess the collective impact of coming together. And so that is a big mission, and we tried to make it a manageable process and developed the tracker tool. So the tracker tool itself is an Excel spreadsheet. It looks a little bit intimidating, particularly to me as someone who, perhaps like Amy has already alluded to, I'm not an Excel expert either, but actually it's, once you've hopefully read the guide on the left-hand side there to making sense of the spreadsheet, it's actually a tool that hopefully someone's able to use as much or as little as they want to. And essentially it hopefully does a bit of the work for you in terms of developing a framework of principles, goals, indicators for the kind of work alliances do. And then there's a set of 5 worksheets to work through depending on where you're at, to try and ask yourself some questions about your work and collect that into in a systematic way, which I know Andrea is going to talk about in more detail. And the tool has been useful, I think, for alliances to take stock of what they've been up to, but also think about their plans for the future. And I've got the link there to where the tracker is, but I'll share that in the chat afterwards. So those 5 worksheets that are there cover these 5 areas. So the foundations, the core conditions for setting up an alliance on the path to success, the ways of working, the principles and values which guide an alliance's activity, the structures and systems that are in place to support that or not, and then moving towards the impacts and outcomes of an alliance's work, and then Hannah had this way of focusing us down to actually significant change. So just really trying to get people to come together and agree on one significant change they think their alliance may have had. And perhaps it's more than one, but I think there was something that Hannah was encouraging everybody to do, Hannah Pitt, to really think about just this one thing that everyone can grab hold on and be really proud of as an alliance. And the track has been developed for some of it to be more useful if your alliance or partnership is at an early stage, and then some of the other questions are perhaps more applicable or can be done in more detail if an alliance or partnership is more mature in its middle and later years. And the tracker, again, it can be something that I know some people, it's been one person perhaps coordinating alliances or partnership work has had a go at using it themselves and then brought in others to review that and follow that process. In other areas, it's been used as a tool to have a small group or team discussion to reflect on activities. And then in some cases, you can't really use the tool with a large scale meeting in its entirety. It's better probably to draw out some of the questions and take them to a larger meeting, a focus group, surveys, or community research as well, peer-to-peer research as well has been done. And then the tool prompts you to gather evidence in different ways, but to log it systematically, which Andrea's going to come on to. So I just wanted to give a brief introduction. I don't want to talk any longer, and just give two examples of two alliances that we've worked with to develop and use the tool. So for Joe in Tower Hamlets in East London, the tool for them has really helped them to think through their work related to poverty and race in Tower Hamlets, which is a particularly diverse part of London. And also, while we have to, each alliance is different, each partnership is different, it does, if people are following a shared framework, you can at least have some comparison conversations with other alliances. You might not be able to robustly compare your alliance with another using this tool, but there are obviously some ways that it can be used to have some peer comparisons. And then in Manchester, Greater Manchester, the tool helped them develop a real story about their alliance. They've done so much, they're working across a very big area, the whole of Greater Manchester, and the tool, I think the tracker tool, helped them just identify the key bits of their story as an alliance, and inevitably working across that kind of large geographical area, there's a risk of loss of collective memory, institutional memory, and again the tool can help them track that and record that, and really importantly reflect on what's worked best or less well. So I really encourage everybody to have a look and just get in touch with us if you'd like to have a more detailed chat about using the tool. I'll stop there and hand over to Andrea.
Okay, I'll just pop my screen on. Anytime this week. There we go. Right, so I was the food power coordinator for Middlesbrough. I've moved on to something else, which I'll get on to towards the end of the PowerPoint, but I was the coordinator for the Food Power Alliance, and I started the process with the evaluation toolkit. I'm just going to draw myself down. Sorry, I can't see the actual slides. So we use the evaluation toolkit as a collective method of evaluation, and it was very much a learning process for us. It was a way of looking through what we were doing, how we were doing it, and creating discussion around that and identifying gaps in knowledge. And one of the ways we did that was to make use of an evidence file, which allowed us to reflect on a whole range of topics based on what we set out to do, what we'd actually done, where we'd changed course, what was the strengths, the limitations, challenges, opportunities, all within that. And then that allowed us to go further with our reporting and develop a plan on going forward and what our new objectives were, what areas of interest we now had that we didn't have before, and any future projects that we were going to take on as an alliance. So one of the things that the toolkits do is they generate this lovely little impact star that you can see on the screen based on what Simon has just spoke about, the 5 foundations. So the toolkit and collection of evidence was completed by me. So I started working through it all, and I put a few scores in that I thought was right. And then I got together with everybody else that was a key member of the Alliance. Now, our key members are people that are involved in democratic services, but also people that are involved in grassroots intervention, direct delivery. And I presented what I thought we'd done, and everybody told me my numbers were far too high and we hadn't done this and we needed to move that down. But what I actually did by us collectively scoring that and being open about how we felt about particular area or key foundation was that we started looking at what evidence we had. Well, if you think that's a 5, how is that a 5? How can you prove that's a 5? Or if we couldn't prove it, did we miss something? Is it a problem with our approach? Is it a problem within a greater system that we don't control? Do people like our method? Are they just not feeding in? Who knows about this particular topic that we've actually failed to address? Who has the knowledge? Can we bring them into the Alliance? And then people would suggest other people to bring into the Alliance and what they could bring to the table, and actually it grew our Alliance as a result of that. So this is our evidence file, and this was at the centre of the toolkit and what we did. So this, the free holiday activities and food provision is a section of our action plan. And when we started looking at the scores and how we can marry evidence up, we come up with an evidence file. And what we did is we numbered all of the evidence we had to prove the impact or demonstrate the impact we had had on any of the points. So you can see that the evidence file actually corresponds with the actions that we were planning to take. And that helped us look at where we didn't have any evidence and why didn't we have any evidence and how do we generate that evidence, which then in the second and third year action plans, we were able to build in strategic processes or projects to feed that action and develop that evidence and ultimately improve people's quality of life. So this is the toolkit, and going off all of what I've just said is you can't address a problem if you don't know what the problems are. So when you go through the toolkit, it looks a bit daunting then, you're not supposed to be able to read it, don't worry. But you go through and you score yourself and you give an example of your evidence. One of the things we were able to do was we embedded our evidence. So there's an attendance log there that's embedded, which allows people to go through. And if they don't think we can evidence that, they can click the evidence and then argue yay or nay that that does evidence that point. And sometimes, you know, it's a bit of a wound, but it doesn't evidence the point and you have to go back and readdress that. But what it does is it makes you look at it systematically and it makes you approach it in a way that actually creates a level of understanding around the effectiveness of the Alliance as a whole. One of the issues we had very early on was engagement, and we didn't know why we were struggling with engagement. We had all of the typical conversations about, oh, people don't have the time, they don't have the capacity, workload issues. But actually, when we started looking for evidence, we went and spoke to people, and it was a lot of the grassroots and the direct delivery. They just didn't feel comfortable sitting around the table with council and public health and various other peoples, and not because they're bad people, but because they were uncomfortable in that situation, or they were not paid for their time, they were a kick, so every hour matters, and they couldn't afford to sit at that table and lose money potentially at a 2-hour meeting where organisations such as councils and public health and people that are salaried can. So it was a way of addressing that. We now have really good engagement because we've worked out that we do these bi-monthly, we make them an hour and a half, and we do them online so that people don't have to take a trip across town. So that evidence led to a direct change in the Alliance, actually for the better. It's so much better now, it's so much stronger. And then we were also able to use the evidence to build intervention based on that evidence and actually use that evidence and that intervention to support services. One of the areas that we made a massive difference in was at the unclaimed benefits team in Middlesbrough. So we were able to use all of our evidence and all of our mapping and all of our data that we've collected as an Alliance, along with the evaluation data that we were generating, to look at deserts and how we could take interventions that didn't have a hub or a location and pair them up with another member of the Alliance who had a facility. And then we had unclaimed benefit checks in a school for a whole community that identified £250,000 in 3 days because nobody had done any intervention in that area for so long due to lack of facilities. And as you can see, we've racked up a whole host of money that in the 3 years, that's how much has been identified for people, which is a massive amount. So off the back of all of that, it makes reporting really, really easy. If all your evidence is in one place, it's accessible. Someone can ask you for something and you can give them it straight away. And we've been able to, I'm just finalising it, do an evaluative report, which is a comprehensive report, all our strengths, limitations, challenges, opportunities, how we've tackled those, how we seized the opportunity, have we not? And it's a full evaluation into the effectiveness. It's not about this is great and this one isn't. It's about how effective are we as a collective. So that report uses robust data sets to demonstrate evidence from all of the teams and all of the members of the Alliance. And it has quotes and statements within the evaluation that allows us to say, yes, we've identified this amount of money, or yes, we've done this amount of cooking sessions, but actually it has the quote from an organisation there that shows how that actually impacted on their direct delivery. So we didn't just deliver the sessions, but we actually made a difference, and people in the community benefited from that organisation knowing more about food safety and allergen awareness when they were preparing food for the community and the most vulnerable groups, which was really, really important to us as an alliance. So going forward, the toolkit demonstrated many areas that we had to work on, and improving access to good quality food, increasing engagement within the alliance, looking for support where knowledge was weak, providing support and funding service to grassroots, and growing advocacy as a core element. And those 5 objectives are at the centre of everything we do and everything we develop now. And actually capacity being stretched was one of the biggest issues. So we now have a dedicated chair, food power coordinator, and an eco shop coordinator, which is myself. And we've got a new food power coordinator going forward. So it allowed us to diversify everything we do and appoint positions based on skill levels and the level of need for people. So that was us.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrea. We've had a lot of praise in the chat about how impressive the numbers that you were sharing there were, and how brilliant that was. So yeah, a lot of people really interested in that work, which is really good and shows how effective it was. Just before we go into the Q&A, so just to let everyone know, we'll wrap up by 10 past, quarter past at the latest. And if you have any more questions, do pop them in the Q&A. We've had some questions in the chat and the Q&A. And before that, I wondered if any of the panelists could have any reflections on what they've heard from the other panelists. So it was sparking off a few things for me. So if anyone wants to mull on that, feel free to mull on that and come back to it after I've asked a few of the questions. But I think, yes, there was something that you said, Hannah, around the response, resilience and recovery report, and how it's quite comprehensive and there's quite a lot of questions in it, and actually getting people to do that number of questions is quite a lot of work. And I agree. So we didn't have time to go through absolutely everything within the report, but to give an overview of that, there was several thematic areas. We had questions on children's access to food, so those are questions on things like the Healthy Start scheme, the voucher scheme, free school meals, holiday provision. So that's one of the themes. And then we had physical access to food, including older people's physical access. We had food growing, we had climate. So there's a lot in there, and more than what I've just said. But I think in terms of replicating the work, I'm going to be publishing a blog or a briefing about this quite soon, which I'll share with everyone who's attended this event as well. It would be very possible for people just to replicate one area. So if you're particularly concerned with, say, children's food, there's been a lot of concern, rightly so, about that, and children's food poverty in particular. You could, I looked at that and stripped it back to the most basic questions, and I think there was only 3 or 4 questions that you'd actually have to ask. So you could do something that was just very targeted, or if you wanted to do the section about food growing, I think that would be, Amy could speak to that more, but a little bit more questions overall, but it wouldn't be this very long survey that has to go to lots of different departments within the council, and you have to get different types of expertise. It could be something that you could send just to one person or contact within the council, because the way we did it is we had a lead point of contact and they then disseminated it to their council contact. So it was quite odd. Well, it could be a fair amount of work for them, and it's brilliant that so many engaged, but even with our relationships as they are within London, there's still some councils who aren't able to collect answers to all of the sections within the survey. So it can still be difficult, and there's definitely work that we need to do there. So it just made me think of that when you were saying that, Hannah. Does anyone else have any, before I move on to the Q&A that I've seen, does anyone else have any reflections that they wanted to share? You'll have a chance at the end as well if you don't just now. Brilliant. I will just get the questions up. So there's a few questions that came through in the chat, and then there's some in the Q&A. And we had one, I think that was for the Response, Resilience and Recovery report. Did you identify points or areas in the survey this year that will bring changes to future reports? So anything that came out of this. So I think this is for you and I, Amy. I can speak to it a little bit, and then if you want to jump in as well, Amy, that would be really useful. I think that as I said in the presentation, the two things that we found that were really, really important that had been emphasized previously but just emerged far more and as far more important this time was the pre-existence of food partnerships and food poverty alliances, which we've been talking about today. So it really evidences the efficacy of those as forming a strong foundation that enabled a better emergency response, a more joined up response where people weren't kind of falling through the cracks as much. And then these kind of cash first approaches as well. So I think we'll continue to have a focus on those aspects within future surveys that we perhaps haven't emphasized quite as much in past surveys. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Amy?
Yeah, to add to that, I think obviously this was very dependent on what happened with COVID, but we adapted the existing structure of the questions that were largely present and past tense. So they were largely, what have you got X in place? Are you doing this? Whereas this time round, we said, as Morven just said, about having foundational things in place. So we said, what did you have in place before COVID? And that gave us some really rich information about the existing foundations that help councils respond well during COVID. Then we said, what were you doing during the crisis? And then we said, what is involved in your recovery planning, and asking it in a sort of a three steps like that, we found really helpful to understand also what the councils were planning on doing. So I think next year we'll probably ask, and we can ask if that actually had been done, what they said they were planning. And also it gives us a chance to support, councils as well. When they said they were planning something, we can then go back to them and say, do you need support on that? Can we help you in any way? And similarly, I think this was brought up in the chat as well about, did we ask questions on other independent organisations doing stuff as well as councils? So this report and the survey was aimed at just London councils, but I think it was very useful hearing about how many partner organisations and grassroots organisations the councils are working with. So I would just say that next year we would make sure we kept including space for councils to talk about who they were working with, so we could follow up with them as well.
That's definitely the case, and we did because we want to use it as a campaigning tool that's directed at local authorities. It's very much questions about what the council did, but we did give kind of within the scoring, there's a lot of room for have you worked collaboratively in a genuine collaboration style way with other local organizations. And it is very true, I think someone put in the chat or the questions about how there's loads of work that isn't council run, and that is all valid and really, really important work. It's just that this report was looking at what councils can do because it is such a campaign focused tool. Brilliant, thanks for that. We've had a few kind of technical questions that I'll just cover off as well. that were around email addresses. I think most people have put their email addresses in. It's in now in the, you can see in the Q&A, there's like 3 columns. There's open, answered and dismissed. So the answered ones are just ones that we've answered live or written answers to. And most of those have people's email addresses in now who are happy to share. So if people want to get in touch with any of us from Sustain who've shared our email addresses, that's absolutely fine. And we also had a few questions around the sharing the actual survey questions in the Response, Resilience and Recovery report. At the moment, they're not on the website anywhere, mainly because it's quite vast, but we are happy to share a lot of the methodology. And as I said, I'm going to be putting out a briefing that will contain some of those. I think if there is appetite for this, if people are really keen, just do get in contact with me. My email address is on there. If you want to, do this type of work in your area and you want to know more about the questions, just get in contact with me directly. At the moment, they're not in a shareable format, basically, but we are happy to share our work. And yeah, on to some more questions. So we had a question about, are there any food partnerships run entirely by volunteers or run by part-timers? And Hannah, I think you did a bit of a written answer to this, but was there anything that you wanted to add as well? No, all good, covered off. Okay, brilliant.
It may well be that the leads at Food Power and Sustainable Food Places would be able to give you a story of development of lots of other places, but I've just got Bucks and Oxfordshire in my mind.
Brill. Yes. To my knowledge, a lot of them are very dependent on volunteers as well, but a lot of them have paid staff time as well to do the coordination work, because it is a hefty bit of work. Okay, brilliant. So we've got another question. What has this meant for those you are intending to influence, e.g. in Middlesbrough or Buckinghamshire? How has this work influenced the decision makers in your area? So brackets council, so decision makers in local government. Andrea, did you want to speak to this at all? And then we can come back to Hannah as well.
Yeah, so we have a lot of buy-in from the council. So we're sort of a bit of a bull in a china shop in Middlesbrough, but if you don't ask, you don't get. But what we do is, because we are so heavy on evidence, we can go to them and say, well, actually, we've been doing this for X amount of time, and this is the results that it's yielded. Please support us, please buy in. And actually, as a result, during COVID, we were asked to the Food Power Alliance was asked to support the recovery phase. We consulted quite a lot on the emergency response. So we were invited to consult and write a paper with public health professionals about what COVID means to the area and how it's potentially going to affect, looking at food bank data, as we were working really closely with the food bank and trying to get a grip on the situation back in March. And then as it unfolded, it went on a lot longer than anyone anticipated. We were then asked to be part of the recovery programme with our eco shops. So that is the Food Power Alliance eco shops are sustainable pop-up supermarkets. You can get 10 items for £2 plus fresh fruit and vegetables. And that's now the preferred method of food redistribution in Middlesbrough through, with the council. Their funding now, panels have consulted with us and we've provided recommendations on things that we find really important, such as going forward, people applying for funding will need to, they don't have to become an Alliance member, it's not a stipulation, but they do have to register their provision with the Alliance so we can map it and document exactly what's going on in the landscape, because we found a lot of duplication of service and they were experiencing the same thing in funding. We just weren't talking to each other about it. So they were having the same problems we just weren't talking. And one of the other recommendations that I'm incredibly proud that we've managed to get through is that people providing food now have to be registered with environmental health, and if they're not, they'll be supported to register, because for me it's not good enough to just give somebody food. You've got to give people safe food and good quality food. You can't just give them anything. So that's one of the other elements we've managed to work with the council on on as well. And very recently, and I'm so excited, we've also managed to get a surplus food hub. We're going to have Fair Share in Teesside soon. It's been about 2.5 years worth of working, but it's been a gradual process with the council, but now they've got buy-in. We've got support from lots of different charities, all working together with the council, with public health, all sitting around the same table. And we've managed to achieve amazing things by just sort of, and online meetings are a godsend with the council. I don't know if anybody else has this experience, but engagement with the council, if they can do it from their desk, is much higher than if they have to travel to your site. I've just found it amazing how much more engagement we have from the council now it's online. So yeah, the toolkit does massively impact what we can do.
Yeah, interesting silver lining of COVID and the strange working situation that we're all in at the moment. Some things actually become a little bit easier, so it's always good to hear about the positives. Hannah, was there anything you wanted to add from your own experience in terms of impact?
Yeah, we're at a very early stage compared to Middlesbrough. You know, when I've seen the Middlesbrough work on the impact tracker, it's just amazing. And clearly you've got some really, really engaged people in the partnership and working in so many different areas. So for us, really, you know, it's kind of like that. What do you do before you've got lots of engagement? Which is a useful question, but I think that it will build, and I think that you know, if we start doing it annually, that will be useful. At the moment, we've got the right kind of people taking an interest, and that includes, you know, obviously the community sector. Then you've got umbrella organisations from within the business sector. We've got a couple of food businesses, but they like to see action, whereas at the moment we're talking about action. So, you know, that's going to take a little bit more time. We've got some really good engagement from public health and from the local communities team, which now has a food lead, and we're trying to get more traction with the climate and resource teams and climate and air quality, I think they call it. So, you know, it's quite difficult to get food in with that at the first stage, but, you know, at least giving evidence of the impact of food from a climate point of view starts to get that into thinking and consultation and, you know, hopefully along the line policy at quite an early stage with them. So I suppose it's this thing about if you measure it, you care about it, isn't it? If you put this information starkly out on the table and say, this is the situation now, here's the good bits, here's the not so good bits, what are we going to do about it? You're in a much, much stronger position for lots of different people, stakeholders, actors and departments to take action than you would be if you were sort of saying, well, we think that it's like this, but it's not. So, but, you know, but we don't really know. So I think, you know, it does take work. All of these processes are not something that you can do in half an hour or even a day. Probably took me about 10 days in total to put all this together. But I think the impact will be there and we'll feel it, you know, into the future.
Brilliant, thanks. And we had a little bit of a question specifically around the Response Resilience and Recovery report in London and what we're doing to take this forward and impact there. We're writing tailored letters with the reports to all of the, not all councils, we're sending out letters to all of the council leaders, but we're also sending out more tailored ones to the ones where we think more work needs to be done, and kind of looking at their scores, looking at where they've done well, looking at where they've done not so well. So the councils that are kind of lower down on the, we didn't actually have a league table this time, as Amy mentioned, but who haven't done quite as well, who aren't showing as much good work on food, and saying, here's how you could do a little bit better, trying to arrange meetings with officers about that, and just using that, the report as a way to keep influencing and keep pushing. And we'll hopefully have a follow-up report, or possibly break back into 2 reports next year. And that often it's kind of how people have done in 1 year, and then looking at how they've done in the next year, that can drive them forward to do good work. So that's the more behind the scenes kind of campaigning that we're doing through the report. And we continue to have webinars like these. This one is much more about approach and methodology, but we're having some other follow-up webinars about specific aspects of that, where we're having speakers talking about, we're having one on cash first approaches in a couple of weeks' time, where we'll hear from speakers from the Independent Food Aid Network and a couple of speakers from various different councils as well. So we'll be using those as a way to keep pushing on certain aspects of the report, and saying how important it is, say, to have cash first approaches. We're almost at time. I've seen that there's quite a lot of answers that have been answered in the chat, with the speakers writing answers to them. So thanks everyone for doing that. Do look at the answered column if you've asked a question that has disappeared from the open column. Has anybody, we've got a question from Martin, has anybody collected participation data for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities specifically? The pictures using these reports are very white. It's a really important point, and we put in some questions in the Response, Resilience and Recovery report for the first time on what local authorities were doing we had a question about minority ethnic communities having access to food growing spaces, having access to green spaces in general. We had questions about culturally appropriate foods within food aid, and about minority ethnic communities being able to access some of the emergency response. It was a bit of a new question for councils, so a lot of them aren't really measuring it. A lot of the councils in London, the communities that they serve are very diverse, and sometimes some of them are minority white. So some of them kind of came back and said, by having these services in place, they actually serve people of all ethnic backgrounds, by the fact that that's our demographic, which has some merit and perhaps is also a bit of a get out. But it was also a new area, so a lot of them didn't really know what to do with the question, but also some of them said that they found that quite useful as a way to get thinking about it. So it was a little bit hard to write up within the report. I think we have a half page in the report on the responses from them. We have some case studies, but it's definitely an area that we want to develop more, because yeah, food justice is tied up with racial injustice as well. Simon had a hand there.
Just to add to that, yeah, it's something with one of the recent funding rounds we've been offering through Food Power. We've been asking more explicitly to ask some of the projects to capture data around the groups that they're reaching. Ethnicity and data is sometimes more easier to collect than some of the other. We've asked people to also ask perhaps around disability, health conditions, and asking if that data is already collected. Really, we're not really asking people to collect that on top of what they might already collect, because that's too burdensome, I think, currently with the amount of money we had available. But I do think there's some learning there to build that in much more. And the impact tracker, again, prompts to think about different groups, but I do think given sort of growing commitments around racial justice in particular, we do perhaps need to just go into the tracker again and check that it's really prompting across different equality groups and characteristics.
Thanks for that. There are more questions, but hopefully they've mainly been answered, because we are at time and I don't want to keep people past what they've signed up for. We had a question about the next webinar in this series, which is going to happen on the 23rd of February at 10:30 a.m. I've posted that in response to the question, but all of these links, there's been quite a lot of links flying around, so we will send those out in the follow-up email, as well as the recording itself. So that will come at some point later this week for anyone who has signed up for this webinar. So on that note, thanks very much to all of our speakers. Thanks everybody for joining, and hopefully see you at some future webinars in this series.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Morven. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.